Hi everyone, welcome back. We're starting chapter 9, one of my favorite chapters about developmental psychology. Hopefully you're going to find some real relevance in this. We have some really cool videos to watch and things to talk about with this one. So let's get right into it. What is developmental psychology? Well, developmental psychology is the study of how we physically, socially, and cognitively develop. And so we're going to be talking about the physical part probably today, and then as we get into Piaget tomorrow, and then the section 3, we'll be doing more of the cognitive and social development. So parts of our development include our genes, that's what we're going to talk about today, and what we carry with us. It's also going to be affected by our environment, so our historical era that we live in, the cultural and social and family context in which we live in. We're also born with perceptions and personality, like a temperament, as this section talked about, but also we're going to develop attitudes and perceptions and some personality traits as we get into those experiences. And the meaning and consequences of experiences really can have a lasting effect on us as well. One of the things that developmental psychologists do is lots of experiments. You'll see the experiment with the kids, and she's trying to test probably something to do with his cognitive abilities. So everybody has this differences of why one person is like different than another. So why does one person adjust going off to college and one doesn't? These are things that we can kind of look at from different angles, one a developmental angle, and then in next chapter, chapter 11, we're going to be talking about personality, and that can also be influenced by that as well. There are two different methods they talked about in this chapter that we've kind of looked at before, longitudinal studies, so tracking a particular group, the same group over a year. So you may take the same kindergarten class and track them all the way until their senior year and look for some specific thing in their development, like their cognitive ability and how it's changed over time. You can also do cross-sectional. It's kind of like our stratified sample kind of thing, where you're taking a group from specific from in this age group or developmental stage, and you're looking at specific things. So a cognitive study might do people and their changes in their memory from their 45, 55, 65, 75, 85, and look at what the ability is level of all those different years to do a study on that. So developmentally, we look at physical, cognitive, social, and we can do that in a cross-sectional design by year. When we look at psychological studies that are developmental, we look at 3 specific things. We look at the lifespan. What is normally what people do in in an age group? And it's usually by age that we have this kind of basic idea of development. So usually kids that are 18 are going to college or work. There's no longer any school. They usually graduate around the age of 18. What do kids do around 5 or 6? Think about that. What do kids do around 5 or 6? They go to kindergarten. So that particular number 1 is really about what normally is happening in a relatively amount of age. If somebody is 15 and they're going to college, that's something very different for that child. Maybe they're very gifted and are going off to college much earlier than their peers. That can have some developmental things with it as well. There's also critical periods. We'll be talking about those, where you really have sensitivity. One we'll talk about today or in the next section about physical development is the embryonic period, and how that's a critical period of development when the baby is in the womb. And if anything, any pterogens come in and affect that part of the period, there could be some developmental and birth defects that develop. Infancy and language, attachment, when attachment is going to occur, and when that's lasting, and when that can really be sort of the point of no return, and so forth. When are those critical periods that we need to have those developmental things happen? And then thirdly, we're going to talk about epigenetics and that idea of heredity versus environment, and showing that potential for genetic predispositions and when they come out be dominant. So let's first of all talk about genetics. That's what we're going to talk about in this section, and make sure that you understand what is going on in this section. This could be a review from biology, and some of you could still be really confused about it and so forth. So let's just briefly go over this section, and then I'll show you a video on your alleles and genes and chromosomes and all that kind of stuff. So we start out as a zygote, that little cell. We get that fertilization, as you see at the top there, and then the fertilization happens, and we have a zygote, and then that's rapid cell division is going to happen, right? And then we're going to eventually get into having an embryo. When you have that cell division and we start having those cells and cells, each cell is going to have how many chromosomes? So think about that answer. How many chromosomes is a cell going to have? Your answer should be 46. It has 23 pairs. 23 plus 23 is 46. You're going to have one of those chromosomes be from mom and one of those chromosomes be from dad. And that's what you see at that diagram there is the two sides. And these are the alleles. These sides are the alleles. Now, let me ask you this. What is wrapped up around that chromosome? What is wrapped around the chromosomes? That is your DNA. Your DNA is wrapped around the chromosomes, and then a section of that DNA, as you see on the diagram there, is a gene. So each chromosome has a different set of genes on it, okay? And we have 23 pairs of those. And then when they're put together by you, by the parents, and then you, we're going to have some that are going to be recessive and some that are going to be dominant. Now, one important thing about genes is that they contain the genetic instructions, and they make up all the protein molecules. And all that creation of proteins is going to create body tissue, which is going to create body functions. And that's more important, as we've talked about the genetic blueprint, then that's one of the things why genes are not the be and end all of what we kind of generate. It's because those genes create body tissue and body functions, and then that sort of takes over from it. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to pause the video, my video, and then I want you to go in and I want you to watch the Amoeba Sisters video that explains an example of our alleles and so forth, and then come on back. Okay, hopefully that was helpful, and you kind of get an idea of what an allele is and then how it comes from your mom and your dad. So really good review for that. So again, your genotype is whatever that genotype is. Like, is it big B, little b, you know, big T, little t, whatever it is. And those chromosome pairs are what make up, you know, all of that, okay? The genotype has two copies, one from mom, one from dad, and then it's got a pairing of alleles. You'll either have big B, big B, big B, little b, or little b, okay, depending. And as you saw, she has, because she can't taste the paper in her science experiment, her parents each have a dominant trait, and they each have a little trait, and she got the two little traits, which means she doesn't have that gene. Think about somebody in your own family that maybe has a different hair color or different eye color, or maybe they have different skin tone. My cousin has a very kind of Hawaiian looking skin tone, and we're like, where did you come from? All of us have like very fair skin. Well, she probably has a dominant gene from my grandmother, who is Native American. It's partially Native American. Now, I probably have that gene in me, and this Native American trait, but I don't have any phenotype for it. It has not come up. So her, just like the lady in the video with the tasting of the paper, hers came out as that little recessive gene that it probably has the dominant gene. The two dominant alleles came out from my grandmother or somebody, right? And then that was passed along. And then she has that skin color, which is totally different from everybody else. Everybody thought that she was adopted. That's how different she looks from the rest of us. She has the same eyes, same nose, which is weird, but then the skin color is just amazing. So the human genotype is all humans have specific genes. We all have genes for hair color, eye color, skin, whatever it might be. Again, this tasting of this paper that she's talking about, it's the alleles that make us different. It's whatever we got from our mom and dad, and however it comes up, that's making us all unique, okay? Our karyotype, as you saw in the video, she has all of her sets of chromosomes, is all those pairing of those chromosomes. Now, the 23rd chromosome is the one that we call the sex chromosome, and that determines sex. Females have an XX, males have an XY, because eggs create X and sperm have X or Y, okay? And the X chromosomes are bigger and have more genes than the Y chromosomes. So that's why if females have two XXs, they have some protection against genetic disorders that maybe men wouldn't have, okay? So remember that your sex chromosome is your 23rd. Now again, the phenotype is what shows up. For her in the video, it was the fact that she could not taste the bitterness on the paper. For us, like I have blue eyes, so my phenotype is blue. So what would be my genetic makeup? What would be my possible genotypes? Well, if in this example, big B was blue eyes, that would be my dominant allele, and little b is green eyes, then I could have a possibility of 3 different genotypes. I could have big B, because I have blue eyes. I could have big B, little b, because I only need the dominant allele to be just one. I would not have little b, though, because then I would definitely have green eyes. So my genotypes are big B, little b. All right? And that is the reason why I have that phenotype. Now, why is it that genes are not part of the blueprint, that genes guide everything, which has been thought about in the past? Well, they've come up with some things, especially with environment and epigenetics over time, that really they've seen over that because of the influence of genes. So genes don't control directly control development, traits, or behaviors. Rather, it's our proteins in our body and our tissue that really are what genes create to do those behaviors, okay? Number 2, environment can influence your phenotype. So if it's just a genetic thing, then your phenotype would have nothing to do with your environment. But we know from the examples in the book that, for instance, if you have a dominant gene for freckles and you're not in the sun, then those freckles wouldn't necessarily come out or be displayed as a phenotype because you don't have the environmental. In addition, some genotypes are much more sensitive for certain people, and so forth. They talked about sunburn. So certain phenotypes would be susceptible. So if you had fairer skin, then your genotypes makes you more susceptible to sunburn than somebody who has darker skin. So that proves that really genes don't guide everything, that there's other factors as well. One interesting thing that I found that's not in your book is what are some cultural views of genetics and biology when it comes to babies and development. And here's a question that's going to seem very odd to you, but can a child have more than one biological father? Can a child have more than one biological father? The answer would be no. We know that physically that can't happen. There is a sperm that fertilizes the egg and it comes from one, unless it's a surrogate and there was some mixture of different sperm, but still it would be one sperm that would fertilize an egg and it would be one biological father. We cannot assume that everyone around the world believes this, that science and medical knowledge is not believed by everyone. There are 18 cultural groups that believe in partial paternity. There can be more than one biological father, okay? I gave you some examples here. So the Canela in Brazil, they believe that the fetus keeps absorbing sperm until it's born. So women will have sex with various partners to get different traits. I want this trait from this man, this trait, and this trait, and this trait, and think that that's going to come out in their baby. The Bari in Venezuela and Colombia, they have multiple partners to be secondary fathers. So they believe that not the physical part of the biology, like the Canela, but the fact that they are responsible and they'll have better survival because each of those fathers will bring resources to the family. Now, like the Bari, the Asha in Paraguay, they want those men there for protection because there is a cultural aspect of their village that it's very respectful to be killers and to be in these fight clubs, and that 3/4 of the children die before the age of 15 because they're in these fight clubs with other children. And so they want these extra biological fathers and multiple fathers to protect the children in that village. So again, social culture is really interesting when we look at even something that's just point blank can't be right. There are people around the world that we have to respect their views on science and and what they believe is, more than one biological father. And even though it seems very, you know, apparent to us, to other people, their culture is going to say something different about how they think and behave. So let's lastly talk about epigenetics, and so important. We know all of this from twin studies. We talked about it in the intelligence unit, and how twin studies have told us if we have two twins separated at birth, two different environments is going to yield two different things for a child, and so forth. There's no change in DNA. It's just automatically it's going to be environment, and we'll talk about what environment plays and what the internal factors can play as well, because it's not always environment, but that's what epigenetics talks about. Okay, so epigenetics is the study of cellular mechanisms that control genetic expression, and how genetic expressions impact health and also behavior. So we know that some genes can be activated and some can never be expressed. So you may have a gene on one of your chromosomes that is there and it's dominant, but it's possibility of being dominant, and it can change and it can mutate and never be expressed, but then all of a sudden be expressed depending on internal and external factors. So internally, the way that genes work is the activity of other genes, cells and stuff talk to each other. There can be some internal chemical changes that can also then make a gene be more expressed. And then, of course, we have the environmental factors and so forth. So I'll tell you a brief story, a personal story about my family. For instance, my family has the gene for bipolar. My dad has bipolarism, and my sister does as well. There's probably some environmental factors that had both of them develop bipolarism later on in life. My dad was more in his 50s. And my sister was in her early 20s, and she's on medication. My dad's doing really well. He's not in any manic states, but for a while there, he was in a manic state from probably some stress in his life, and was making really rash decisions, spending a lot of money, and so forth. And so that made that gene sort of emerge. My sister went through some trauma in her life as well. I mean, how does a person who came out of the same household not get bipolarism like myself and be very different from my sister? And that's because of the environmental things that she went through. And so because of some of that trauma, it's not that I didn't go through stress, but because of some of the trauma that she went through personally in her life, that's probably when that bipolarism came out. And she's doing much better now, and her moods are much more consistent than they used to be. So that's really interesting when you look at somebody growing up in the same, it doesn't even have to be the same household, different households, and in the same household you get two different people who maybe I don't have the gene, I don't know, maybe I don't have that gene at all, and how somebody can have a totally different experience. Things can also be genetic. I mean, think about in terms of physical health as well. Think about, do you have any cardiovascular disease in your family? They ask you this at the doctor because it is something that can be carried on. And depending on the environment that you have, so are you having any environmental stress? If you see on the diagram, smoking, diet, any chemical contaminants, toxins, exposure to extra toxins and pollutants that other people aren't, and also social stress, and all those can increase your risk of cardiovascular, especially if you are genetically predisposed to it. So it's all kinds of different things that we can have be expressed in genes. One of the important studies that they did, of two that I'm going to show you, Michael Meany did studies on newborn rats, and he was looking at nature versus nurture. And today, psychologists, remember, from the intelligence unit, believe that it's both nature and nurture. It just depends on the percentage, which percentage of genes are related to behavior and thinking, and what is more environmental in the way that we act. And they say a little bit of both, but it depends on this and that. And it also depends on what it is, how much percentage of a specific fact. So all the things that we do all have different percentages as to what genetics and environment played a role in that. So he took some newborn rats that were already predisposed. We all have a temperament, as they talked about in this chapter, of being predisposed to a certain temperament. That can be related to personality as well. So a temperament that we're born with, and these newborn rats were very skittish and nervous and very high strung. and they were paired with a calm and stress-resistant mother. And then controversial to that, there were very calm rats that were paired with an inattentive mother. And what did that yield? Well, we really found out that the upbringing does make a difference. In the very end of this section, of this chapter, in the little extra Psych in Your Life, you have to read that section. It will talk about parenting styles, and that's really important because that's the upbringing part that we're talking about. So also, when children grow up in certain environments and households, they will also take on sort of the temperament of their parents. So calm and stress-resistant children become parents that are also calm and stress-resistant, and so forth. And so that makes a difference in how these rats coped and so forth. Okay. Another thing to look at is what kind of stress is brought up, you know, and what does that look like? You know, what is stress? And stress is such a huge subject that we talk about because it does have a dramatic effect on environment. I mean, it is, when we talk about that, it's not just abuse and trauma, it can be just general stress and how it can trigger genes as well. So one of the things, the newer things that's discussed in psychology today is the idea of ACEs, and that we all have an ACE score. So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, and how they can affect and create trauma and changes in the brain. And the reason why I did this is because the book, you know, brings up some studies about suicide victims, and when it looks at when children are abused, they have distinct marks in their brain tissue that are different from suicide victims they had seen that were not abused. And so the ACEs and stress that we have on our lives can be that. I have some ACEs. One, I had my best friend died in high school, very traumatic experience. It wasn't abuse or neglect or sexual abuse or anything like that, but it was a traumatic event. That would be an ACE. My parents got divorced. That wasn't early on, that was later on in life, but that would be an ACE of that. Substance abuse, my sister had a drug issue in high school. That would be an ACE. Mental illness, my family, like I just said, has mental illness in it, so that would be an ACE. So I had 4 already. Okay. So any of those could be, it's abuse, neglect, household dysfunction. You can have mental illness of yourself or someone else, being treated improperly, somebody going to prison in your household. And the more ACEs you have, the higher your score, more at risk for certain things and so forth. So there's little tests you can take online that can test how many ACEs you have, and we'll be bringing this up again when we talk about clinical psychology as well. But I thought it was an important spot to kind of put it in because of stress upbringing. The last thing I want to talk about is a study I found on epigenetics as well, as more positive in manner. And this was something that neuroscientists found in 2009 about the what we can do to counter that stress, right? And exercise, we've talked about some really big benefits, cardiovascular and mental health-wise. And remember, we also talked about effects on the brain. With exercise, it can create neurogenesis and so forth in the brain, and helping with the hippocampus with memory as well. So they put some rats to a test, just like they sort of did with the newborns that Michael did with his test with temperament. And he put rats in a stressful situation. He placed them in a new cage environment, or he made some of them swim in a beaker, which is so, I don't even want to think about that. But of course, that was very stressful because they thought they were going to drown. So after the stress, the animals then ran on a wheel and so forth. And they had higher levels in terms of higher levels of histone and acetylation across their cells in part of their hippocampus where neurogenesis occurs. So that neurogenesis was happening, and the active animals acted less stressed than the sedentary rats that had not been exposed that had been re-exposed to the stressful scenarios and had not had exercise. So basically, through the whole thing, they proved at least with rats, that these rats were able to cope better when they were active. And so we can counter some of the stress really with that and help that brain health by doing lots of exercise. All right, go in to the next video and you'll have some interactive stuff to do with that.